Welcome to the Spunky Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, psychic medium Carrie Muggs. This is where we learn all things spirit, everything from spiritual gifts, awakenings, ghosts, aliens, and starseeds. Nothing is untouchable, but always fun and spunky. I am honored to be on this spiritual journey with you, so make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Carrie Connects. Last week I did miss. I'm sorry. I really try to do once a week every time, but some weeks are just harder than others and I do the best I can. So this week though, I think the last podcast we talked about UFOs and a lot of people loved it. A lot of people loved it. So I know lots of people love the paranormal stuff. And I love the paranormal stuff because I have to be honest, there is a fine line between self-help and spiritual awakening and mental issues, and I don't like to cross those boundaries sometimes. So as much as I am for self-help and spiritual awakening, and I will do quite a bit on that, it's just a fine line that I don't like to cross sometimes because sometimes it can lead to, sometimes spiritual awakening stuff can also lead to psychosis or things like that. And that's just not I'm not an expert in that. And I have family members that do have that have had in the past some mental stuff. And so it's just something you don't mess with. And it's something I don't want to mess with. And it's spiritual awakenings and spiritual growth and mental stuff are very, very parallel with each other. So and I am just fascinated with the paranormal stuff. I'm just fascinated with it. Even sometimes not the scary stuff, because I know lots of people think it's evil when it's really not. It's just trying to figure out what's going on. They're like spirits that are sad, that need mental help, right? So anyways, long story short, last week we talked about UFOs. This week we're going to talk about the fairies or the fae. Lots of people, talk about fairies or fae and folklore, and some people think that they're very fictional. Tinkerbell at Disney is one of my favorite fairies. I know that my daughter loves Tinkerbell. And when I had Shannon Schwartz on my podcast, I think it was about a year ago, and she's a palm reader. She's very, very good. She talked about seeing a gnome in the woods, and she's very close to fairies or the fae. So I just have been fascinated because I believe at one time I had seen a fairy. It was in my backyard and it was just really tiny and it was for 1 second. And so I have always believed in fairies of some sort, but I always believed in things like 4-leaf clovers and that dragons were existent in one time or in maybe in a different realm or at one time, because I just feel like they had to exist somewhere at one time for us to believe in them now or to see them now. They're myths and stories. They don't, they have to come from something. So a fairy is also known as the fae, the fair folk, the fairy. They can be known to be nice and mean. And I think that this is also very extraordinary because just like people that can be nice or mean, or just like spirits that can be nice or mean, the fae, all types of different things can be nice or mean. Any mythical creatures can be nice or mean. So they're known as a mythical being or a legendary creature found in multiple European cultures. So we have Celtic, Slavic, German, English, and French folklore. They all believe in the fae. And if you see some of the movies today, lots of different movies have different fairies in them. And I'm trying to think of Lord of the Rings. They have the fae or the fairies. Any kind of supernatural books always probably include the fairies or that they always bring up. They always have that. What am I trying to say? That there's always the fairies and then the gnomes and the dwarfs and all different types of legendary folklore. So a lot of people think that they are paranormal or a form of spirit, and a form of spirit in like, described as metaphysical, supernatural, and so I just think it all combines. It all combines somehow, and I just think it's so magical, and I think it's kind of cool, and I believe in it. I know that there's just so much that we don't know about that I think everything has and it can exist. I think I'd rather believe that all the good things exist than not. So, and also too, you're talking to somebody whose husband swears he saw Bigfoot. So, and I believe him. Like his story hasn't changed, and it's just an amazing story. So, I love stuff like this. Um, so the name fairy is applied to a magical creature with a human appearance that has wings. It has magical powers, and the thing about fairies is they can be They can be trickery. They have been known to be like they can trick you, so they're manipulative at times, or they trick you into doing things that you don't want, and so you have to be really careful. They're not like Tinkerbell. Sometimes they can trick you into doing different things. Other times, the fairies have been described to be a magical creature, just like goblins and gnomes. And sometimes it can just mean they just are enchanted or magical. And it can be like a fairy place or a fairy kingdom or the land of the fairy. So it can just be like a magical place. Some people think that you need to ward off fairies. Some people think that they can be a nuisance. There's and some people use protective charms to not let them. It's kind of interesting because it's just like spirits too, right? So common charms that people use to ward off fairies are church bells. They wear their clothes inside out. They four-leaf clovers. I love four-leaf clovers because when I was little, he'd always look at the clover patches and he'd always be like, "You're going to have such good luck if you find a four-leaf clover." And one time I was at my babysitter's house and I found a four-leaf clover and I gave it to the babysitter and I asked her to please keep it safe for me. And by the time I left that day, they couldn't find it and I was devastated. They do say that if you keep milk and honey out for the fairies, they love that. And it's so crazy because I read some books in Fablehaven that I do know that once they had a drink of milk, a certain kind of milk, their eyes would be open and they would be able to see the different magical, mythical, legendary creatures around the Fablehaven place, and fairies are one of them. So fairies are also sometimes thought to haunt specific locations. So the more I kind of looked into fairies, the more I kind of realized that a lot of it has to do with just like spirits, like spiritual ghosts. Like a lot of them, they're like mythical or paranormal things. And sometimes if they can lead travelers astray from different locations, if they don't want them to go there, fairies were often blamed for sickness back in the day. A lot of people thought that they were being cursed by the fairies. And a lot of times there's been, a lot of people talk about fairy circles. What are fairy circles? And it's usually a patch of land that is encircled by a growth of grass, or if you have some grass out in the backyard and the little flowers or the clover flowers make a ring, that's considered a fairy circle. Any kind of ring or circle surface on the earth is considered maybe a fairy circle. And the exact how these fairy circles occur is unknown. And they usually appear in like arid landscapes or grassy vegetation, and they surprisingly form like in regular patterns. And a lot of people say that you do not mess with fairy circles, that you stay out of fairy circles. I think it would be the opposite. I think that you would be in a fairy circle and get good luck from it, but I'm just naive to think everything's awesome and great and the good things, like everything comes of good things. I do have a fairy garden in my backyard. I love it. I love just the imagining of little fairies living in this little place, but I also used to love to play Barbies when I was little and had little magical. I had an aunt who had a love for small, small things. My Aunt Brenda, and she's passed now, but she used to love little tiny things. And I always just imagined that the fairies would come and play with these little tiny things that she had, or that she would collect. I just thought it was so interesting. I just loved it. And I kind of think sometimes that her love for these small things was because she had a small love for the fairies and she just didn't maybe know it. Um, there's some of fairy circles are there are circles in Africa. They've been there for a long time. Some fairy circles have been spotted over large areas of remote landscapes. Um, it's so crazy to me too because I think that fairy circles are very similar to crop circles. Like there's gotta be, you guys. This is why I do this. It's this because there's gotta be some sort of symbolic or some sort of tie or something because it's spiritual and paranormal. It kind of goes together somehow. Like the spiritual of ghost and UFO on Skinwalker Ranch is the same. It's the same kind of signs and symbols and waves or electronic devices. And I kind of feel like, fairies and gnomes are part of a same similar thing, just in the earth. They're kind of the earth. So when we call on, angels of the earth or the things of the earth, like when I do an opening, when I open up a spirit circle, or I always call on Mother Earth. And I feel like the gnomes and the fairies and these things are part of the earth, And so I think it's really, really cool. So some scientists, they believe that these fairy circles there's a very big scientific explanation for them, but sometimes there's not. So it's just kind of like crop circles, right? But they have been told many, many times. I have heard they're called fairy circles or fairy rings. That you're not supposed to stand in the middle of them. Not supposed to stand in the middle of them at all, because it makes the fairies mad or gets them upset. So they're also known as elf circles, elf rings, a pixie ring. It is kind of a natural ring or arc. It can be made of mushrooms, it can be made of flowers, it can be made of grass. They're mostly found in forested areas. And they are, just like really just circles out of nowhere. And some people say they can be dangerous or hazardous. And so that's not really my favorite, because I always think that they're great and wonderful. But so that's kind of like, it just depends. It depends on if you want to think. I think they're magical and I think it's kind of cool, but some people are scared of them because fairies sometimes don't have a great, some people are scared of them, just like ghosts and just like UFOs. Some people are scared of the fairies. I've always had really good experiences, any type of fairy thing that I have, but I also have a fairy garden and I leave, I like to have fun, and I think it's fun to leave milk out there for them and pretend. I've always loved make-believe and magic and all that kind of stuff. There's just an innocence about it. So, everybody can make a little bit of bad out of the good. So they are mostly from Irish, Scottish, and English folklore too. And the fairy comes from the Latin word. So these are just some things that I looked up when I was researching fairies. The fairy comes from the Latin word fata, which means fate or destiny, which I kind of thought was cool because they're so cool. I do sometimes, there are some fairy people on Instagram that I like to follow, that they kind of give, different fairy things. I think Karen K is one of them. I use her fairy oracle deck sometimes. Fairies are also depicted as tiny humanoid creatures with wings, but they can also appear as animals. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they could appear as animals. And some of them are friendly and helpful, and others are mischievous and even dangerous. And so this is, again, one of those, just like people, there's good ones and bad ones, and you have to just kind of watch out. They are known for their magical powers, which include healing, shape-shifting, and creating illusions, which I love. I love healing. I love shape-shifting. And shape-shifting is good and bad. There's like shapeshifters, skinwalkers shape-shift, and they're known to be not good. So shape-shifting can be a good and bad thing, and creating illusions. I do know that they, especially inside fairy circles, you can have different illusions of things, or they can make you believe things. And this is where their trickery comes in, or their manipulativeness comes in. And they're very associated to the earth and nature. They are mostly in forests and in meadows and in other natural settings. If you guys have seen a fairy, I would love it. I do remember seeing one when I was little, and I do know that there are some people out there that have seen him. I would love to hear your stories, because I tried to look for stories that were so cool and I couldn't really find any. But if you have any fairy stories, I would love to hear them. And there are many different types of fairies. Okay, so there's fairies that are brownies, pixies, and leprechauns. I didn't know leprechauns were considered fairies. I didn't know that. And I don't really know pixies. I know there's pixie dust. And I always call that time when you're half asleep and half awake, I call it the Tinkerbell time, because Peter Pan always tells her he's going to come to her in her dreams when she's not quite awake, but she's not quite asleep. And that's like that's like a little bit of the astral realm, and it's a super magical time. So I always call it the fairy, the Tinkerbell time. And I love pixie dust. I love to create it. I love to pretend. Like sometimes if I'm in a bad mood, I'll just pretend that I'm like throwing pixie dust around in. Yeah, so that's kind of funny too. Fairies fairies can control the weather, and they're often associated with rainbows. That's why leprechauns are always at the end of the rainbow. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. And some fairies are said. Now, this is kind of where I think that they get their bad. In the olden days, they get their bad name because fairies were known to kidnap children and replace them with changelings. So I'm thinking the fairies would kidnap children and put a decoy there, or put I don't even know what a changeling would be, but that kind of gives fairies a bad name back in the day too. And they usually wear clothes made from leaves and flowers, and they can be appeased by offering food or drink, mostly milk and honey. I thought that was super awesome too. And many cultures have their own versions of fairy folklore. So Scandinavian is the Huldras, and the Native American are little people. So every culture kind of has a different name for a fairy, or a different version of a fairy. And some people believe the existence of fairies is supernatural, just like ghosts. And then some people believe that they are purely fictional, that they're just something made up, and that's okay. Whatever you believe, that's fine, because the government hasn't come out and said fairies are real like they have UFOs. So who knows? But there is a study of fairies, and it's called folklore. And I actually have been very interested in this. So when I kind of start doing paranormal studies, I kind of do look into the folklore a little bit. And fairies continue to be a really popular subject in the pop culture. That's what I said, like with some of the movies that have the fae and all of that, all of the different, like Lord of the Rings. And I'm sure there's other movies out there that have fairies in them that I don't know about. And there's also April Pike, I think is her name. She wrote book just on the fae. She writes so she's friends with the girl who wrote, I don't even know, the lady who wrote the book about the vampires with Edward. And I was never big into those kind of lot, but I do know she had a friend who wrote good books about the fae, and I did like that too. So yeah. So I think, you just have to ask yourself, what do you believe in fairies, or do you not believe in fairies? I fully believe. I once saw a little tiny fairy, and I do believe in them, and I do believe in gnomes. And that's why when my friend was like, I saw this little gnome, I was like, no way, because I think I have. What's in our backyard in the apple tree, I'm pretty sure I saw a fairy. So I would be interested in your stories about fairies. So if you have any kind of stories about the fae, or any kind of fairy stories, let me know about them, and I will share them with my audience. And I think that would be really, really cool. So Yeah, there you go. You guys, I'm going to start kind of talking a lot about, I am going to do some self help stuff, but I think this stuff is so fascinating too. And I am going to start to kind of dig deeper. Lately, I've just been giving you like a synopsis of it, but I will start to dig deeper and kind of tell stories. I'm kind of just thinking I'm kind of in the midst of what I'm going to do with this podcast, if I want to go one way or the other. So I would really love your input, what you guys would like to hear, because we're going to kind of either give it a makeover and put it in, what kind of stuff do you guys want to hear? I'd really be fascinated because I want to know if you want to hear about the self help stuff or the spiritual awakening stuff, or do you rather hear about stuff like paranormal things? I'd really love your input. So message me at Carrie Muggs, Carrie at CarrieMuggs.com, or you can DM me on Instagram or Facebook, Carrie Muggs on Instagram and Spunky Spirit page on Facebook. So love you guys so much, and I will talk to you next week. If you liked this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode.